What I'd like to do in this video is take you on a little bit of a journey through the chronology of the Pacific theatre of the Second World War. I'd like to give you an overview of how the war in Asia and the Pacific played out from beginning to end, and I want to try and do it really quickly. So I'm compressing, if you like, about four, depending on how you want to count it, 4 years of history into about, hopefully, no more than 7 or 8 minutes. Now, let's start then with the rise of Tojo's militarist regime, its nationalist conservative regime in Imperial Japan. Japan turns to the military as a form of government through the 1920s and 1930s, a little bit in the same way in which Germans have turned to the Nazis. Japan was actually on the Allied side of the First World War. Technically, they were meant to be the winners of the war, but they carried their own grievance. The parliamentary government of Japan was weak, and we see by 1937 a army government taking power, in which the army really ran all aspects of foreign policy, defense policy, and so on. This Japanese government had a great deal of territorial ambition, just as the Nazis had their drive for Lebensraum. The Japanese had a belief in a co-prosperity sphere, an empire across Asia. And this led them to wars of aggression, firstly in Manchuria from 1931 onwards, and then in China from 1937 onwards. So if you're in Asia, you could actually argue there are much earlier starting dates to World War II, 1931, 1937, and you will see these in textbooks. These conflicts throughout the 1937s that Japan became involved in led to increased tension with the European empires that still existed in Asia. This was particularly a conflict that emerged with Britain, the naval power of the era, supposedly the dominant power of the era, and the United States, the great Pacific power, the emerging Pacific power of the era. So when I'm saying that there were tensions emerging while these wars were taking place in Manchuria and China as the Japanese expanded, the tensions grew with the United States and Britain as well, and there was an increasing amount of fear within Australia as to Japanese intentions. There was a sense of a Japanese threat towards Australia. Due to that threat, in around 1940, the Australian government and the British government have a significant dispute that plays out on secret cables. The Australian government, under John Curtin, the Labor leader, is demanding that the AIF be sent from the Mediterranean theatre to defend Australia. They want them to come home to Australia. The second AIF volunteers, hardened veterans of the war against the Nazis in Greece, in the Balkans, in North Africa, are being called back by the Australian government to Australia to defend Australian soil. The British, on the other hand, and we'll have a look at maps in another video, the British are wanting these Australian soldiers to defend British interests in India and wanting them to go to Burma. This is all cut short, this debate, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. This brings America into the war. The day after, the British Empire itself is attacked directly off the coast of China in Hong Kong. On Christmas Day, 1941, Hong Kong falls to the Japanese. And on the 27th of December 1941, Curtin's speech is leaked to the media and is printed in Melbourne, in which Australia states that it is looking to America free from any of the ties of kinship, the pangs, the feelings of kinship it may have, family ties that it may have to Britain. It looks to a new, great and powerful friend. The war continues. The Americans are very much on the defensive. The Japanese seem all-conquering in Asia. The US territories in the Philippines quickly fall in the new year to the Japanese. On February 15th, the great British naval base, the great British stronghold in Asia, Singapore, falls to the Japanese. And it's here that large numbers of the AIF, who were delayed on their journey back to Australia during this dispute with Britain, are captured. This then becomes the story of the British the Australian and the other allies who are captured in Singapore. They're imprisoned at the famous Changi jail. Some of you would have flown through Changi Airport in Singapore. They become the prisoners of war, POWs, who take part in the building of the Burma Railway, the famous bridge on the River Kwai, which had a movie made about it. The story of men like Weary Dunlop, the great Australian famous military doctor who saved so many lives on those horrible slave labour railways. Australia is attacked at this stage of the war. Bombings take place. Broome is attacked. Darwin is attacked. Over coming months, Townsville, Cairns, Newcastle, Sydney are all attacked. And Australian troops are sent to defend against this imminent threat of invasion, or so it seems at Kokoda in New Guinea. Britain, at this stage of the war, continues its fight in World War II without the AIF. The AIF never go to Burma. Some members of the RAAF, the Australian Air Force, remain in Europe, involved in the bombing campaigns and so on Germany. But most Australian forces return back. The Australians are no longer in North Africa. They're no longer in Europe. They're no longer in Burma. But they are fighting here in the Pacific region. Australians and Americans and new allies are fighting Japan in our region, while the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union and others fight the Nazis and the Italians in Europe. The Americans and other allies are based in and led from Australia during this time. After mid-1942, they're led from Brisbane. General Douglas MacArthur, an important name to remember, creates a base in Brisbane that we now call MacArthur Chambers, and the MacArthur Museum in Brisbane is his office location. The University of Queensland becomes the Australian Army headquarters. The Indooroopilly Golf Course becomes a commando training base. American bases are all over southeast Queensland and Queensland. Troops swell into Brisbane, and this changes the very nature of Australian society. Some would argue that World War II was the beginning of modern Australia. So much changes. The role of women in Australian society changes. Women take on the roles required of them while their men are off fighting, while the men are off fighting against Japan for Australia's survival. American influences move into our nation. Our Australian foreign policy looks to America rather than Britain. We even change our tax system. Until this stage of history, there was no income tax Australia-wide. Each state ran its own taxes. Because of the war effort, Australia has income tax, and you're possibly studying this in the middle of the year. I'm recording this in July, at a time where people get their taxes done. The war continues until 1945, and the Americans develop a strategy known as island hopping. MacArthur says, if resistance of the Japanese is too strong on one set of islands in the Pacific, we'll just bypass and take our navy around it. We'll hop, we'll leapfrog those bases where the Japanese are too strong. We'll starve them out if necessary. We'll just cut them off by sea and air. And so this strategy sees the Americans island hop their way with their allies towards Japan. After two massive battles in 1945 at Iwo Jima and then Okinawa, which are connected to the Japanese island chain, the Japanese archipelago, the Americans decide to employ their secret weapon, the atomic bomb. And 2 atomic bombs are dropped on Japan to end the war in August 1945. After the war, Australians, Americans and other allies occupy Japan. War crimes tribunals are called together to try the Japanese for war crimes. And Hideki Tojo is hung as a war criminal.